Karen's trembling hands gripped the wire cutters as she eyed the pristine white fence. "This ends today," she muttered through gritted teeth. With one swift motion, the metal crunched and the fence collapsed. But as Karen turned to leave, the unmistakable sound of sirens pierced the air. Her eyes went wide with panic. The sheriff had been watching the whole time. In a split second, her world was about to come crashing down. The sun was just peeking over the horizon as Karen made her way to the edge of her neighbor's property, the wire cutters concealed in her jacket pocket. For months, she had seethed with anger every time she looked at that infuriating fence, a constant reminder of the conflict that had torn their once peaceful community apart. It had started innocently enough, a friendly disagreement over the placement of the property line. But as the dispute escalated, tempers flared and accusations flew. Lawyers were brought in, surveys were conducted, and soon the simple fence had become a battleground, a symbol of the growing divide between Karen and her neighbor Sarah. Karen gripped the cold metal of the cutters, her knuckles turning white. "This has gone on long enough," she muttered to herself. With one deep breath, she steeled her nerves and approached the fence. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement, but the neighborhood was still and silent. Carefully, she positioned the cutters against the wire, feeling the tension build as she squeezed the handles. The metal groaned in protest, then suddenly gave way with a sharp crack. Karen flinched, her heart pounding in her ears, but there was no sound of alarm, no shouts of anger. She glanced around again then, with a growing sense of triumph, began to systematically snip through the fence, watching as the pristine white panels crumpled to the ground. As the last section fell, Karen stepped back, a grim smile spreading across her face. "There," she whispered, "now we'll see who's right." Turning on her heel, she started to walk away, already planning her next move. But then the unmistakable wail of a siren shattered the silence, and Karen's blood ran cold. She spun around, her eyes going wide with terror as a sheriff's car came barreling down the street, its lights flashing. "No, no, no," Karen muttered, her heart pounding as she watched the car skid to a stop just a few feet away. The driver's side door swung open, and a tall, imposing figure in a crisp uniform stepped out, his hand resting on the holster at his side. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stop right there," the sheriff said, his voice low and commanding. Karen froze, her mind racing as she realized that she had been caught red-handed, the evidence of her crime lying in twisted heaps all around her. "Sheriff, I can explain," she stammered, her voice shaking with fear and desperation. "Save it," the sheriff said, his eyes narrowing as he approached her. "You're under arrest for destruction of private property. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Karen's stomach lurched as the sheriff grabbed her arm and roughly spun her around, snapping a pair of handcuffs around her wrists. She opened her mouth to protest, to beg for mercy, but the words caught in her throat as the sheriff pushed her towards the waiting car, her world crashing down around her. The ride to the police station was a blur for Karen. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the morning over and over, desperately searching for a way out of the mess she had created. As the sheriff drove in silence, Karen's eyes darted around the inside of the car, looking for any possible escape route, but the metal cage separating them was unbreakable. When they arrived at the station, the sheriff gripped Karen's arm and led her inside, the click of the handcuffs echoing through the lobby. Karen's heart pounded as she was marched past the rows of desks and into a small interrogation room, the sheriff motioning for her to sit in the hard metal chair. "Now," he said, fixing Karen with a stern gaze, "you're going to tell me exactly what happened back there." Karen swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "Sheriff, I didn't mean to cause any trouble," she began, her voice quivering. "It's just that Sarah and I have been fighting about that fence for months, and I just couldn't take it anymore. I thought if I got rid of it, maybe we could start over, you know." The sheriff's brow furrowed as he listened to her explanation. "Ma'am, I understand that you and your neighbor have been having some disagreements, but that doesn't give you the right to take the law into your own hands. Destroying private property is a crime, plain and simple. Karen felt her stomach twist with a mixture of fear and shame. I know, she said, her eyes pleading. But can't you just let me off with a warning? I promised it won't happen again. The sheriff shook his head. I'm afraid I can't do that. You've broken the law, and now you're going to have to face the consequences. He paused, his expression softening slightly. Look, I know this is a tough situation, but the best thing you can do now is cooperate and let the legal system handle it. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the sheriff held up a hand to stop her. I'm going to have to ask you a few more questions, and then we'll see about getting you booked and processed. You have the right to an attorney, so I'd suggest you start thinking about who you want to call. As the sheriff stepped out of the room, Karen felt the weight of her situation pressing down on her. She had acted impulsively, driven by her anger and frustration, and now she was facing the very real possibility of serious legal consequences. Tears welled up in her eyes as she realized that this was no longer just a dispute between neighbors. It was a criminal case, and she was the accused. Karen sat in the cold, stark room, her mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios, each one more dire than the last. She had to find a way out of this, a way to make things right. But as the minutes ticked by, she knew that her options were quickly dwindling, and the reality of her predicament was becoming increasingly clear. Sarah stared out the window, her eyes fixed on the shattered remains of the fence that had once stood proudly between her property and Karen's. The morning sun cast long shadows across the broken panels, a silent testament to the chaos that had unfolded just moments ago. She had been sipping her coffee, lost in thought, when the unmistakable sound of the sheriff's siren had pierced the air. Rushing to the window, she had seen the officer apprehending Karen, her neighbor's face etched with panic and despair. Sarah's heart had raced, a mixture of shock and disbelief at what was unfolding before her eyes. Now, as the reality of the situation sank in, Sarah felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. On one hand, she was relieved to see that the authorities had intervened, that Karen's blatant act of vandalism had not gone unchecked. After months of bitter arguments and endless legal wrangling, it seemed that justice was finally being served. But as Sarah replayed the scene in her mind, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy for her neighbor. Karen had always been a kind, if somewhat eccentric, woman, a fixture in the community who was known for her colorful garden and friendly waves to passers-by. To see her being led away in handcuffs, her normally vibrant demeanor reduced to one of utter despair, was a sobering sight. Sarah sighed heavily, setting down her coffee mug and turning away from the window. She knew that this was not the end of the story, that the repercussions of Karen's actions would reverberate through their small town for weeks, if not months, to come. The legal process would grind on, with lawyers and judges and endless court appearances, and Sarah found herself dreading the prospect of being dragged back into the fray. As she moved through her morning routine, Sarah's mind kept returning to the events of the day. What had driven Karen to such a desperate act? Was there something more to this conflict than just a simple property dispute? Sarah found herself remembering the countless times she and Karen had exchanged heated words, each one trying to stake their claim and defend their position. She shook her head, realizing that the blame could not be placed solely on Karen's shoulders. They had both played a role in escalating the situation, allowing their personal animosity to cloud their judgment and ruin any chance of a peaceful resolution. With a heavy heart, Sarah made her way to the kitchen, her eyes falling once again on the remains of the fence. She paused, considering her next move. Perhaps, she thought, this was an opportunity to extend an olive branch, to try and find a way to mend the rift that had grown between them. After all, they were still neighbors, and regardless of their differences, they would have to find a way to coexist in this community. Steeling her resolve, Sarah picked up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number for the sheriff's office. It was time to take the first step towards reconciliation, no matter how difficult it might be. The interrogation room felt like a cell, the stark white walls and harsh fluorescent lights bearing down on Karen as she sat, her hands cuffed behind her back. She had answered the sheriff's questions as best she could, but the fear and anxiety that gripped her made it difficult to think clearly. When the sheriff returned, his expression was somber. "Mrs. Anderson, I'm afraid I have some bad news," he said, taking a seat across the table from her. Karen's heart sank. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your neighbor, Sarah, has decided to press charges against you for the destruction of her property," the sheriff said. "That means you're facing a felony charge and the potential for some serious jail time." Karen felt her stomach lurch. "Jail time," she repeated, her eyes widening in horror. "But I didn't mean for things to go this far. I just wanted to get rid of the fence, to try and make peace between us." The sheriff sighed, shaking his head. "I understand you were trying to resolve the dispute, but the law is clear. Destroying someone else's property, even if it's out of frustration, is a crime. And with Sarah pressing charges, the prosecutors will be looking to make an example out of you." Karen's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out of this nightmare. "There has to be something we can do," she pleaded. "Can't we just talk to Sarah? Try to work this out? I'm sure if she understood where I was coming from, she'd be willing to drop the charges." The sheriff shook his head again. "I'm afraid it's not that simple. The decision to press charges is out of my hands now. The wheels of the legal system are already in motion, and there's not much I can do to stop them." Tears welled up in Karen's eyes as the reality of her situation sank in. She had never imagined that her impulsive actions would lead to such dire consequences. The thought of spending time behind bars was almost too much to bear. "What am I going to do?" she whispered, her voice breaking with anguish. "I can't go to jail, Sheriff. I have a life, a family. I can't just throw it all away because of one stupid mistake." The sheriff regarded her with a sympathetic expression. "I know this is a difficult situation, Mrs. Anderson. But the best thing you can do now is to cooperate fully with the legal process and work with an attorney to build the strongest possible defense." He paused, his brow furrowing. "You said you have a family. Is there someone you can call, someone who can help you through this?" Karen nodded, her mind racing. "Yes, my husband," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to call him. Let him know what's happened." The sheriff nodded, standing up from the table. "All right, I'll make the arrangements. In the meantime, try to stay calm. This isn't over yet, and with the right legal representation, there may still be a way to resolve this without the most severe consequences." As the sheriff left the room, Karen felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. Her entire life had been turned upside down in a matter of hours, and now she was facing the very real possibility of losing everything. With a shaky breath, she steeled herself for the difficult conversation ahead with her husband, knowing that the road to redemption would be a long and arduous one. The waiting room at the sheriff's station was uncomfortably quiet, save for the occasional creak of a chair or the muffled voice of an officer down the hall. Karen paced nervously, her hands trembling as she replayed the morning's events over and over in her mind. When the door finally opened, Karen felt a surge of relief as her husband, Mark, rushed in. His face was etched with concern as he pulled her into a tight embrace. "Karen, what happened?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "The sheriff called and said you've been arrested." Karen's lips quivered as she tried to find the words. "Oh, Mark, it's a nightmare," she whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. I cut down Sarah's fence, and now she's pressing charges. They're saying I could go to jail." Mark's eyes widened in shock. "You did what?" he exclaimed, pulling back to look at her. "Karen, how could you be so reckless? You know how important that fence dispute is to you." Karen nodded, her shoulders sagging. I know, she said, her voice trembling. I I couldn't take it anymore. The fighting, the lawyers, the constant stress. I thought if I got rid of the fence, maybe we could finally put this whole thing behind us. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. But you can't just take the law into your own hands, Karen. That's a felony charge you're facing. We're talking jail time, fines, a criminal record. His voice trailed off as the gravity of the situation sank in. Karen watched the realization dawn on his face, her heart sinking. What are we going to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark let out a heavy sigh. Well, the first thing we need to do is get you a good lawyer, he said, his brow furrowing in concentration. Someone who can negotiate with the prosecutors, try to get the charges reduced or dropped altogether. Karen nodded, her mind racing. Do you think that's even possible? She asked, a glimmer of hope in her voice. I mean, with Sarah pressing charges and everything. It's not going to be easy, Mark admitted, but we have to try. You're not a criminal, Karen, and this shouldn't define the rest of your life. We'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Karen felt a surge of gratitude towards her husband, and she squeezed his hand tightly. Thank you, Mark, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I don't know what I'd do without you. Just then, the door to the interrogation room opened, and the sheriff stepped out, his expression grave. Mrs. Anderson, your husband is here, he said, nodding towards Mark. I'm afraid I have some more news to share with you both. Karen felt her heart drop as the sheriff motioned for them to follow him back into the room. Whatever was coming, she knew it couldn't be good. As they sat down, the sheriff cleared his throat, his gaze shifting between the two of them. I'm sorry to say this, but it appears that Sarah has decided to take this matter a step further. She's filed a civil lawsuit against you, Mrs. Anderson, in addition to the criminal charges. Karen's breath caught in her throat, and she felt Mark's grip on her hand tighten. A civil lawsuit, Mark said, his voice tinged with disbelief. What does that mean? The sheriff sighed heavily. It means that Sarah is seeking financial damages from you, on top of the criminal charges. This is going to get a lot more complicated, and the stakes just got a whole lot higher. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Karen felt a sense of dread wash over her. The fight was far from over, and the road ahead was only going to get steeper. The conference room of the small law firm felt stifling, the air thick with tension as Karen, Mark, and their attorney, Emily, pored over the stack of legal documents before them. Okay, let me make sure I have this straight, Emily said, her brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah has filed both criminal charges against you, Karen, for destruction of property, as well as a civil lawsuit seeking financial damages. Karen nodded, her fingers nervously tapping the tabletop. That's right. The sheriff said the criminal charges could mean jail time, and the civil case could cost us even more money. Emily let out a heavy sigh, her eyes scanning the documents once more. This is a tricky situation, no doubt about it. The prosecutors are going to be looking to make an example out of you, and Sarah seems determined to throw the book at you in both the criminal and civil cases. Mark leaned forward, his expression etched with worry. So what are our options here? Is there any way we can get the charges reduced or the civil case dismissed? Emily pursed her lips, considering the question carefully. Well, the criminal case is the more urgent matter. If we can negotiate a plea deal with the prosecutors, we may be able to avoid jail time and get the charges reduced to a misdemeanor. That would at least limit the damage to your criminal record. Karen felt a glimmer of hope at Emily's words. And the civil case? She asked, her voice tentative. That's a tougher nut to crack, Emily admitted. Sarah is seeking substantial damages, and with the criminal charges already in place, she has a strong argument that you acted with malice and caused her significant financial harm. The hope in Karen's eyes faded, replaced by a sense of dread. So what are our chances of winning that case? Emily paused, her gaze shifting between the two of them. Honestly, it's an uphill battle. The deck is stacked against you, and if Sarah's team can prove her case, the financial damages could be crippling. Mark let out a frustrated groan, running a hand through his hair. This is a nightmare, he muttered, his eyes narrowing. Karen, why on earth did you do this? You know how important that fence was to Sarah, and now we're facing the consequences. Karen felt the familiar sting of tears in her eyes, her throat tightening with emotion. I know, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was just so tired of the fighting, the stress. I thought if I got rid of the fence, it would be the end of it. Well, it's far from over now, Mark said, his tone sharp. We're looking at potentially losing everything. Our savings, our home, even your freedom. All because you couldn't keep your temper in check. Emily cleared her throat, sensing the tension in the room. Look, I know this is a difficult situation, but we can't give up yet. We still have some options to explore, and I'm going to do everything in my power to minimize the damage here. Karen nodded, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Okay, Emily. What do we do next? First, let's focus on the criminal case, Emily said, her voice firm. I'm going to reach out to the prosecutors and see if we can negotiate a plea deal. If we can get the charges reduced, that will give us a stronger position going into the civil case. She paused, her gaze fixing on Karen. But you need to understand, Karen. The prosecutors are going to be looking for some kind of admission of guilt or acceptance of responsibility. They won't go easy on you unless you're willing to cooperate fully. Karen swallowed hard, her mind racing. I understand, she said, her voice shaky. Whatever it takes, I just want to make this right. As the meeting continued, Karen felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her, the consequences of her impulsive decision looming ever larger. The road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, but she knew that she had no choice but to face it head-on, no matter how daunting the challenge might be. The courthouse was alive with activity as Karen and Mark made their way through the grand, marble-lined halls. Karen's heart pounded in her chest, her palms sweaty as she clutched the strap of her handbag. This was it, the moment of truth, when her fate would be decided. As they approached the courtroom, Emily, their attorney, met them with a solemn expression. All right, you two, she said, her voice low and serious. This is where it all comes down. The prosecutors have agreed to a plea deal, but it's not going to be easy. Karen felt a surge of trepidation. What are the terms? She asked, her voice barely audible. Emily let out a heavy sigh. Well, the good news is that they're willing to drop the felony charge in exchange for a misdemeanor plea. That means no jail time, but you'll still have a criminal record. Mark let out a relieved breath. That's something, at least, he said, his brow furrowing. But what about the civil case? That's the tricky part, Emily said, her expression grave. Sarah is demanding a substantial amount in damages, and the judge has indicated that he's inclined to rule in her favor. The best we can hope for is to negotiate a payment plan that won't completely wipe us out. Karen felt her stomach twist into knots. How much are we talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. Based on the evidence they've presented, the judge is looking at around $50,000 in damages, Emily said, her words landing like a punch to the gut. Karen's eyes went wide with shock. $50,000, she gasped, her voice cracking. That's everything we have. We'll be ruined. Mark reached out and squeezed her hand, his own face etched with worry. Emily, there has to be another way, he pleaded. Surely we can negotiate this down, or at least get them to agree to a more manageable payment plan. Emily shook her head, her expression sympathetic. I wish I could say that, Mark, but Sarah's legal team is playing hardball. They know they have the upper hand, and they're determined to make an example of Karen. The weight of the situation bore down on Karen, her mind racing with 1,000 different scenarios, each one more dire than the last. Facing a criminal record was bad enough, but the prospect of losing everything they had worked for, their savings, their home, Their sense of financial security was simply too much to bear. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't lose everything. Not after everything we've built. It's not fair." Emily placed a hand on Karen's shoulder, her expression sympathetic. "I know this is a lot to take in, Karen, but you have to stay strong. We're going to fight this, I promise you. We'll negotiate, we'll appeal, we'll do whatever it takes to minimize the damage." Karen nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." As they entered the courtroom, Karen felt the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her. Sarah sat across the aisle, her expression a mix of triumph and resentment. Karen steeled herself, determined to face the consequences of her actions with as much dignity as she could muster. Whatever happened next, she knew that the fight was far from over. The courtroom was tense as the judge took his seat, his gavel rapping sharply to call the proceedings to order. Karen sat beside her husband, Mark, their fingers intertwined as they waited with bated breath for the verdict. After hearing the evidence and arguments from both sides, the judge leaned forward, his expression grave. "This has been a complex and emotionally charged case," he began, his voice carrying through the hushed chamber. "The actions taken by the defendant, Mrs. Karen Anderson, were undoubtedly unlawful and destructive. However, I do believe that there are mitigating circumstances that must be taken into account." Karen felt a glimmer of hope flutter in her chest as the judge continued. While Mrs. Anderson's decision to take matters into her own hands was reckless and illegal, the root cause of this conflict was an ongoing dispute between neighbors that had escalated to an unfortunate degree. Both parties share culpability in the deterioration of their relationship and the inability to find a peaceful resolution. The judge paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "Therefore, in the criminal case, I am sentencing Mrs. Anderson to 12 months of probation, with the condition that she complete 100 hours of community service. The felony charge will be reduced to a misdemeanor, and barring any further infractions, this conviction will not permanently mar her record." Karen let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. The sentence was far more lenient than she had anticipated, and the prospect of avoiding jail time was a tremendous weight off her mind. However, the judge's expression darkened as he turned his attention to the civil case. As for the matter of the civil lawsuit filed by the plaintiff, Mrs. Sarah Thompson, I find the evidence presented to be compelling. Mrs. Anderson's actions did indeed cause significant financial harm, and I am awarding Mrs. Thompson $35,000 in damages. The color drained from Karen's face as the gravity of the ruling sank in. Though the criminal sentence was manageable, the civil penalty was a devastating blow, one that would undoubtedly cripple their financial stability for years to come. Mark squeezed Karen's hand, his own expression grim. $35,000, he murmured, shaking his head in disbelief. "How are we going to come up with that kind of money?" Emily, their attorney, leaned in, her voice low and urgent. The judge did agree to a payment plan, but it's still going to be a heavy burden. We'll need to work closely with Mrs. Thompson's team to negotiate the terms and try to minimize the monthly payments as much as possible. Karen felt a surge of resentment towards her neighbor, her lips pressed into a thin line. "After everything I've been through, after nearly going to jail, she still gets to take our money," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "It's not fair." "I know, Karen, I know," Mark said, his tone soothing. "But we have to focus on moving forward now. This isn't over yet. We'll fight this, I promise. We'll find a way to get through this, no matter how difficult it may be." As the judge adjourned the proceedings, Karen felt a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and a deep sense of uncertainty about the future. The battle had been hard fought, but the war was far from over. With a heavy heart, she knew that the road ahead would be long and arduous, but she was determined to face it head-on, no matter the cost.